The humidity in the Florida Keys doesn't just sit on you, it breathes. I wiped the condensation off a bottle of cheap lager, looking out at the neon sign for Sofia's grotto. Two letters were flickering, the S and the G appropriate, I thought. I was failing, and the grotto was sinking. Across the street, a fleet of white SUVs was parked like sharks in a shallow reef. Demetrius and his developers were back. They didn't want my beer. They wanted my silence. My bar was a relic of a Florida that was dying. Salt-stained wood and regulars who smelled like sunscreen and regret. But the property taxes had tripled. Every shop on the block, the bait shop, the bakery, the hardware store had a for sale sign. We were the last holdouts on the waterfront. I had exactly $300 in the register and a final notice to vacate that arrived this morning. I was 27 and I was losing my family's legacy. Double bourbon, neat, and keep the bottle close. The voice was like silk sliding over gravel. I looked up to see a man who didn't fit. He was wearing a linen suit that cost more than my car, and his watch glinted under the dim bar lights. He wasn't one of Demetrius's sharks. He looked tired, like a man who had seen the edge of the world and decided to sit down for a drink. I poured the liquid gold. Rough day? I asked. He looked at me, his eyes piercing. Rough decade, Sofia? I froze. How do you know my name? He nodded toward the business license framed behind the bar. Sofia Moretti, third generation owner. You're currently $80,000 in the hole, and Demetrius is offering you a fraction of what this land is worth. He took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact. My name is Stephen Taylor. I used to be Demetrius's lead strategist. I'm the man who designed the plan to bankrupt this street. And now I'm the man who's going to help you save it. I laughed, but it felt hollow. Look, Mr. Taylor, if you're a private equity guy, you're late to the party. The shark's already circled. Stephen leaned in, the scent of expensive tobacco following him. I'm not equity. I'm the architect who was betrayed. Demetrius left me for dead in a Cayman legal battle so he could keep the profits. I don't want your land, Sofia. I wanted to show you how to turn his own contracts into a noose. We aren't going to fight him with money. We're going to fight him with theater. I looked out the window. Demetrius, a man with a smile like a razor blade, was pointing at my roof. He didn't just want to build condos. He wanted to erase history. Why me? I asked. Stephen Taylor set a heavy gold-plated coin on the counter. Because you're the only one who hasn't signed. You're the anchor. If you don't move, his billion-dollar project is just a pile of wet sand, but we have to move fast. He thinks he's playing a game of power. He doesn't realize we're playing a game of fine print. I can't fight a billionaire with a bottle of bourbon, I hissed. Stephen smiled, a cold, predatory expression. We're going to use a living heritage trust. Do you know what happens to a development project when the soil is declared a protected historical zone? All his permits become scrap paper, I blinked. Is it protected? Stephen leaned back. It will be by tomorrow morning. Your father didn't hide money under these floorboards, Sophia. He had a zoning loophole that Demetrius never saw coming. The plan was audacious. It wasn't about violence. It was about social manipulation and legal chess. What about the other shops? I asked. The bait shop? Sarah's bakery? Stephen Taylor finished his glass. We're going to build a united front. But first, you have to convince them to trust a man who used to be their enemy. Tonight, we host a secret town hall in the back room. No cameras, no Demetrius. Just the people who are tired of being pushed around. By midnight, the grotto's back room was packed. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and desperation. Old Man Miller from the hardware store and Sarah from the bakery sat in the booths, looking at Stephen Taylor with pure suspicion. He's the one who sent the first eviction letters. Miller yelled. Stephen stood up, unfazed. I am. And that's exactly why I'm the only one who knows the flaw in the master lease. Demetrius isn't buying your land. He's buying options that expire at sunrise. Stephen Taylor opened a leather briefcase, revealing a stack of blueprints. Demetrius is using his shell company to bypass environmental laws. If we can prove this block is a co-op heritage site before 8 a.m., his options become void. He loses his $50 million deposit, and the land reverts back to the business owners. The room went silent. This wasn't just a bar anymore. It was the center of a financial sting. If we win, Stephen said, he effectively funds your retirement. The twist came faster than I expected. As Stephen was explaining the loophole, the front door of the grotto kicked open. It wasn't the police. It was Demetrius himself, dressed in a tuxedo and looking utterly bored. He wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a digital tablet. "Stephen," he said, shaking his head. "I thought I smelled a rat. Did you really think I wouldn't track your GPS? You always were a romantic. Trying to save the locals with the dusty old ledger?" I stepped in front of Stephen Taylor, crossing my arms. "Get out of my bar, Demetrius. You aren't invited." Demetrius ignored me, scrolling through his screen. "Sophia, honey, look at the screen. I just bought the hardware store and the bakery 5 minutes ago. Your United Front just crumbled." I offered them double what the land is worth. I looked at Miller and Sarah. They looked at the floor. The weight of the money was too much. The plan was dead before it even started. Stephen Taylor didn't look defeated. He actually chuckled. "Double, Demetrius. That was generous of you." Demetrius smirked. "It was efficient. Now, Sophia, sign the final release for the grotto, or I'll have the city condemn this place for a leaky roof by 9 a.m. I felt the air leave the room. I looked at Stephen, feeling like a fool for trusting a man in a linen suit, but Stephen winked at me. "Demetrius, did you actually read the transfer of title clauses in those new contracts you just signed?" Demetrius's smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "It's a standard buyout." Stephen Taylor leaned against the bar. "Not quite. Since this block was declared an area of critical concern by a private filing I made 3 hours ago, any new owner is legally responsible for the $10 million environmental cleanup fee per building. By buying them out, Demetrius, you didn't get their land. You just inherited $60 million in immediate, non-negotiable debt." The dramatic reversal hit like a physical blow. Demetrius looked at his tablet, his fingers frantically tapping. "That's impossible. I didn't see that filing." Stephen smiled, a witty, triumphant glint in his eye. "That's because it was hidden in the local flavor section of the county website. You were so busy looking at the sky, you didn't look at the dirt. You've just funded the entire neighborhood's restoration, and you don't even own the deeds yet. Choice is yours." Demetrius stared at the tablet, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his silk tie. The lawyers behind him were already whispering frantically, their iPads glowing in the dim bar light. "You're bluffing," Demetrius hissed. No clerk would process a heritage filing at 10 p.m. Stephen Taylor just pointed toward the back of the bar, where the local county clerk was sitting with a ginger ale. "Benefits of a small town, Demetrius. We don't have office hours. We have if the bar is open hours." The room erupted in a chorus of stifled laughter. The power had shifted so fast the air felt charged. Demetrius turned to his legal team, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Fix this, now." But the lead lawyer shook his head. "Sir, if the area of critical concern is active, the cleanup fees are attached to the title holder. By clicking accept on those buyouts, you became the title holder." Demetrius looked at me, realizing he just walked into a $60 million trap. "I'll sue," Demetrius stated, trying to regain his composure. "I'll tie this street up in court for the next 30 years. No one will be able to sell a single slice of bread or a bottle of beer. I leaned over the bar, mirroring his smug grin from earlier. You could do that. Or you could look at the second document Stephen Taylor filed. I nodded to Stephen, who pulled a single golden stamp page from his briefcase. The right of first refusal clause, Stephen added. What now? Demetrius snapped. Stephen Taylor tapped the document. Because this is a living heritage trust, the current business owners have the right to buy back their titles at the original assessed value if a new owner is found to be in environmental default. Since you haven't paid the cleanup fee yet, Demetrius, you are in default. Sarah, Miller, check your phones. A series of pings echoed through the room. The buyback offers just went live for $1 each. Sarah looked at her screen and let out a sob of relief. I just bought my bakery back, and I still have the double payment Demetrius sent me 10 minutes ago. Demetrius's eyes went wide. He had just paid millions to buy the shops, only to have the owners buy them back for $1 while keeping his money. He was literally paying for his own defeat. This is theft, he roared. No, I said. This is a premium for the local flavor you mentioned earlier. Demetrius lunged toward the bar, but Stephen Taylor stepped in the way, cool and unmoving. Demetrius, if you cause a scene, the Heritage Trust bylaws allow us to ban you from the district. That would make it very difficult for you to manage the only property you do still own. Demetrius froze. Which one? Stephen smiled, and I could tell this was his favorite part of the plan. The public restrooms at the end of the pier. You bought the options almost too, remember? The bar exploded into full-blown cheers. The billionaire who wanted to own the coastline was now the proud owner of a public toilet. Demetrius looked like he wanted to scream, but the witty reversal was too airtight. He was caught in a web of his own fine print. I want my money back, he demanded. The payouts were fraudulent. Stephen Taylor shook his head. They were perfectly legal. You just failed to perform due diligence. A rookie mistake, really? So here's the deal, I said, silencing the room. You can keep the pier bathrooms and the $60 million in debt, or you can sign a covenant of non-interference. You walk away, you forget this street exists, and we let the environmental filing expire quietly. Demetrius looked at his lawyers. They gave a solemn, simultaneous nod. They knew he was beaten. If he fought this, he'd lose his entire empire. If he signed, he only lost his pride. Fine, Demetrius spat, grabbing a stylus from his assistant. Give me the document. He signed the digital release with such force he nearly cracked the screen. But don't think this makes us friends, Stephen Taylor. You're finished in the corporate world. No one will ever hire a man who burns his own house down. Stephen straightened his linen suit. I didn't burn it down, Demetrius. I just renovated it for people who actually appreciate the architecture. Demetrius turned and stormed out of the grotto, his fleet of white SUVs peeling away into the Florida night like beaten dogs. The silence that followed was heavy. Then it was broken by Sarah, who walked up and hugged me so hard I could barely breathe. You did it, Sophia. You actually did it. I looked at Stephen, who was calmly finishing the last of his bourbon. We did it, I corrected, but I think we still have a lot of work to do. The town hall turned into a celebration. Miller was handing out free hardware store hats, and Sarah promised a lifetime of croissants for everyone involved. But as the crowd thinned out, Stephen Taylor stayed at the bar. You're a good gambler, Sophia, he said. Most people would have blinked when he offered the money. I started cleaning a glass, the flickering S and G on the sign outside finally settling into a steady, bright neon glow. I knew you wouldn't let me lose, I said. But tell me the truth, was there really a $60 million cleanup fee? Stephen Taylor leaned in, a mischievous glint in his eye. Technically? No, it was a $10,000 fee for a localized drainage issue. But I used a font on the filing that made the K look like an M in Demetrius's digital reader. By the time his lawyers realized it, he had already signed the surrender. I stopped cleaning and stared at him. You won a billionaire's empire with a font choice? Stephen Taylor shrugged. In the world of high-stakes development, the most powerful weapon isn't a bank account. It's typography. Demetrius was so arrogant he didn't check the decimal point. I laughed, the sound echoing through the salt-stained rafters. My father was right. The grotto was built on a solid foundation. It just happened to be a foundation of witty deception. So what happens to you now, Stephen Taylor? I asked. You're a man without a machine. Stephen looked at the gold coin on the bar. I think I've had enough of machines. I was thinking of investing in something a bit more ... permanent. I hear there's a bar in the Keys that needs a new silent partner with a knack for fine print. I looked at him, then at the ledger, then back at my home. The S and G finally stopped flickering, I noted. That's a good sign, Stephen Taylor said, raising his glass. To the grotto. I raised my own glass of soda. To the Heritage Trust, and to the man who bought a public toilet. We clinked glasses as the sun finally cleared the horizon, bathing the street in a warm, golden light. The sharks were gone, the neighbors were owners, and the last round was on the house. The witty reversal was complete, and Sofia's grotto was officially open for business. The morning after the victory felt like a dream, but the silence on the street was real. No engines idling, no surveyors with clipboards. I was opening the grotto at noon when a courier arrived, not with a subpoena, but a gift-wrap box from Demetrius. Inside was a single diamond-encrusted plunger and a note. The plumbing is backed up. See you in court, Sofia. I laughed and set the plunger on the back bar. The war wasn't over. It was just moving into the petty phase. Stephen Taylor walked in 10 minutes later, looking remarkably refreshed for a man who had just dismantled a billionaire's ego. He wasn't wearing the linen suit today. He had on a faded tropical shirt and flip-flops. Nice plunger, he remarked, sliding into his usual stool. I see he's taking the loss with his trademark grace. I poured him a coffee instead of bourbon. He says he'll see us in court. How solid is that Heritage Trust filing, really? Stephen took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the bar. The filing is ironclad, but Demetrius is right about one thing. He has a lot of lawyers with nothing to do. They'll try to attack the living part of the Living Heritage Trust. They'll argue that since the street isn't a museum, it doesn't qualify for protection. I leaned on the counter, the old wood creaking under my weight. It's not a museum, it's a neighborhood. People live here. Work here. Exactly, Stephen said, and that's our next move. To make the trust permanent, we need to prove continuous cultural contribution. We need to show that this block isn't just surviving, it's thriving. He tapped the morning paper. Demetrius just bought the local radio station. He's going to start a smear campaign, calling the street a blighted eyesore to justify a new zoning override. We need to change the narrative before he starts the broadcast. By sunset, we had a new plan. If Demetrius wanted to use the media, we'd use the street itself. The grotto gala, Sarah suggested, her hands covered in flour as she leaned in the bar door. A festival, every shop opening their doors. We show the city that this isn't a blighted zone, it's the heart of the Keys. Miller chimed in from the sidewalk. I can string enough lights to make this place visible from space. Let him try to call a light show an eyesore. But Demetrius was 3 steps ahead. The next morning, a fleet of city maintenance trucks arrived. They weren't there to fix the road. They were there to beautify it by installing a 10-foot-tall construction fence right down the middle of the sidewalk, citing structural integrity issues. It blocked the storefronts completely. He was literally walling us off from our customers. He's trying to starve us out, I hissed, looking at the metal barrier. Stephen Taylor walked the length of the fence, touching the cold steel. He didn't look angry. He looked inspired. He's a genius in his own small, vindictive way, Stephen muttered. This fence is technically a temporary structure under City Code 44B. A temporary structure on a heritage site can be claimed as a canvas for public expression if it remains for more than 24 hours. I caught his drift. You want to paint it? Not just paint it, Stephen corrected. We're going to turn this fence into the world's longest menu. Within hours, the entire street was out with brushes. By the time Demetrius's smear campaign started on the radio, tourists were flocking to the block to see the Great Wall of Grotto. It featured giant murals of Sarah's croissants, Miller's antique tools, and the grotto's famous sunset. We turned his barricade into the best advertisement we ever had. The radio broadcast was a disaster for Demetrius. The host, trying to follow the script, talked about the ugly construction on our street, only for callers to flood the lines describing the incredible outdoor art gallery. Demetrius's voice broke through the airwaves, sounding frantic. It's a safety hazard. The fence is there for a reason. Stephen, sitting at the bar with a portable radio, just smiled. He's losing the room, Sofia, and when you lose the room, you lose the vote. But Demetrius had one more card to play. At the height of the festival, a health inspector arrived, a man who looked remarkably like Demetrius's nephew. He walked straight into the grotto with a clipboard and a scowl. I've had a report of unsanitary wildlife on the premises, he stated. I looked at the bar, then at the inspector. Wildlife? You mean the regulars? He didn't laugh. He pointed to the rafters. I heard there's a protected species of owl nesting in here. The room went silent. If there was a protected species in the building, the law required the bar to be closed and sealed for a 90-day environmental assessment. It was a brilliant, non-violent way to shut me down for the entire season. I don't see any owls, I said, my heart sinking. The inspector pulled out a flashlight and shone it toward a dark corner near the ceiling. Right there, a snowy owl, very rare in Florida, must be an N. Accidental migration. We all looked up. There, perched on a beam, was a white, fluffy shape with large yellow eyes. It was a perfect, majestic owl. My heart stopped. Demetrius had planted a fake bird to trigger an environmental lockdown. I'll have to clear the building immediately, the inspector said, reaching for his sealed tape. But Stephen Taylor stepped forward, squinting at the rafters. Wait a minute. That's not a Boboscandiacus, he said, using the Latin name. The inspector froze. It's clearly a snowy owl. Stephen pulled a small laser pointer from his pocket and aimed it at the owl's chest. The bird let out a high-pitched electronic meow. The room erupted in laughter. That, Stephen said, is a Hootybot 3000. It's a high-end animatronic from Demetrius's own toy subsidiary. It's even wearing a small tag on its leg that says, property of Thorn Taylor Dev. Demetrius had forgotten to remove the inventory stickers. The health inspector turned bright red and tried to shove the animatronic into his bag. But Miller was already there with his phone, recording everything. Fraudulent inspection, planting false evidence, and I think that's a disturbing the peace charge, Miller noted cheerfully. The inspector bolted for the door, leaving the robotic owl behind. Stephen picked it up and set it on the bar. Well, Sofia, looks like we have a new mascot, and Demetrius has a new legal nightmare. The witty reversal was taking on a life of its own. By the end of the weekend, the Great Wall was a landmark. The robotic owl was the star of our social media, and Demetrius was being investigated for regulatory interference. As the sun set on the final day of the gala, I looked at Stephen. He's going to run out of ideas eventually, isn't he? Stephen Taylor looked at the diamond plunger and the robot owl. Maybe, but I hope not. This is the most fun I've had in decades. The news of the robotic owl spread faster than a Florida brush fire. By Monday morning, Demetrius was the laughingstock of the financial world. Headlines across the state read billionaire plays with toys, loses to bartender. I stood on the sidewalk, watching a crew of actual city workers dismantle the Great Wall fence. The city council had revoked the emergency permit, citing Demetrius's pattern of deceptive practices. We had our sidewalk back, and the sun felt warmer than ever. Stephen Taylor was sitting on the tailgate of a truck, watching the steel barrier come down. "He's gone quiet," Stephen noted, tapping a folded memo against his knee. No radio ads, no health inspectors, no diamond-encrusted threats. That's when Demetrius is at his most dangerous, when his ego is bruised enough to make him act like a professional. I leaned against the doorframe of the grotto. "What's the memo?" I asked. "An invitation," Stephen replied, "to a mediation." The meeting was set for a neutral site, the local library's community room. Demetrius was there, but the tuxedo was gone. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit and a look of calculated humility. He didn't have his nephew or his sharks with him. He just had a single elderly lawyer who looked like he'd been practicing since the keys were a territory. "Sofia, Stephen," Demetrius said, standing up. "I think we can all agree that this theatricality ... has gone far enough." "Theatricality?" I asked, taking a seat across from him. "You tried to sell my bar with a battery-operated bird?" Demetrius waved a hand dismissively. "A lapse in judgment by a junior staffer. He's been terminated. I'm here to discuss a mutual exit strategy. I'm willing to sell my remaining options in the district back to the Heritage Trust at cost. No profit, no markup. I just want to move my capital to a region that appreciates modern infrastructure." Stephen Taylor narrowed his eyes, leaning back in the plastic library chair. "At cost, Demetrius? That's not like you. You usually charge a nuisance tax for leaving a deal." The elderly lawyer leaned forward, sliding a contract across the table. "My client is simply eager to close this chapter. The only condition is a non-disparagement agreement. We stop the lawsuits, you stop the murals, and we all walk away with our reputations intact." It sounded too good to be true. I looked at the contract. If we signed, the street was officially ours. The threat would be gone forever. But as I flipped to the final page, I noticed a small, barely visible watermark in the corner of the paper. It was a logo for a company called Blue Horizon Dredging. I looked at Stephen. He had seen it too. His thumb was tracing the edge of the table. "Dredging?" I whispered. Stephen gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Demetrius wasn't giving up on the land. He was giving up on the surface. "You're selling us the shops, Demetrius," Stephen said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm. "But you aren't selling the subsurface riparian rights, are you?" The elderly lawyer's pen stopped midair. Demetrius didn't blink. "The trust is for the heritage of the street, the buildings, the culture. What happens 50 feet underwater in the channel shouldn't concern a group of shopkeepers." Stephen laughed, a sharp, cold sound. "You aren't building condos. You're building a private marina." The witty reversal was back on the table. Demetrius had realized that if he couldn't own the street, he could own the view. By dredging the channel for a mega-yacht marina, he would destroy the very reef that made the Keys beautiful, effectively turning our heritage street into a view of a concrete pier. "The trust covers the land to the high tide line," the lawyer noted smugly. "The state owns the water, and we just secured the dredging lease from the governor's office." Demetrius leaned in, the mask of humility finally slipping. "You won the battle for the dirt, Sofia, but I'm going to build a wall of steel hulls so high you'll never see a sunset again. Your grotto will be a basement in a harbor." He picked up his pen, signed the buyback. "Take your little shops. It's the best deal you'll get before the dredgers arrive on Monday." I felt a surge of panic, but Stephen Taylor was already looking at a map on the library wall. "The high tide line," Stephen muttered, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. Demetrius, you really should spend more time in the local archives and less time at the governor's mansion. Stephen stood up and walked to a dusty shelf of historical records. He pulled out a leather-bound volume from 1922. In the original charter of this district, the high tide line wasn't determined by the water. It was determined by the mangrove root limit. The lawyer frowned. That's an archaic definition. Modern law uses the mean sea level. Stephen shook his head, flipping the book open to a page with a hand-drawn map. Not when the district is a living heritage trust. By law, the trust adopts the definitions of its founding era to preserve historical context. And according to this map, the mangrove root limit extends 300 yards into the channel. Demetrius froze. What does that mean? It means, I said, catching the genius of Stephen's move, that the land owned by the trust doesn't stop at the beach. It includes the water, the seagrass, and every square inch of the channel you were planning to dredge. Stephen tapped the map. You bought a dredging lease for water that technically belongs to a hardware store and a bakery. You've just paid the state for a permit to trespass on a heritage site again. Demetrius turned to his lawyer, his voice a frantic whisper. Is he right? The lawyer was frantically scanning his tablet, his face turning the same shade of purple as Demetrius's. The 1922 charter, it was never superseded. If the trust is active. Oh, God. He looked at Demetrius. Sir, if you dredge that channel, the trust can sue you for ecological vandalism under the 1920s Maritime Code. The fines are calculated in gold doubloons per square foot. The absurdity of the law was the perfect weapon. In 2026, these ancient zombie laws were a nightmare for developers. Gold doubloons? Demetrius choked out. That's not a real currency. It is in this district, I said, standing up. And since you don't have any doubloons, Demetrius, I suppose we'd have to settle for your dredging equipment as collateral. Stephen winked at me. The billionaire was about to lose his fleet to a group of people who used a robotic owl as a mascot. Demetrius slumped back in his chair. He had tried to go over us, then under us, and now he was sinking. The riparian rights trap had snapped shut on his own leg. What do you want now? He asked, his voice defeated. I looked at the contract on the table. The buyback, at cost. But this time include the water. All of it, from the dirt to the horizon. Demetrius grabbed the pen and signed so hard the tip snapped. The witty reversal was now a total victory. Demetrius didn't wait for a handshake. He stormed out of the library, his lawyer trailing behind with the broken pen still gripped in his hand. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the library's ancient air conditioner. Stephen Taylor let out a long, slow breath, leaning against the shelves of 1920s archives. Gold doubloon, Sofia? He chuckled, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. I wasn't sure if that would fly, but his lawyer's fear of zombie laws did the work for us. Is that actually real? I asked, looking at the leather-bound book. The gold doubloon fine? Stephen flipped the book shut with a thud. Technically, it was a maritime penalty for illegal salvaging, but in the heat of a mediation, a billionaire rarely checks the fine print on a currency that hasn't been used in a century. I laughed, the tension finally leaving my chest. We had won the dirt, the air, and now the water. The grotto was no longer a bar on a street. It was the capital of a tiny empire. We walked back to the waterfront under a sky that seemed impossibly blue. Sarah and Miller were already waiting at the bar, having heard the news through the small-town grapevine. The dredging lease is ours, Miller asked, his eyes wide. Better, I said, sliding the signed contract onto the bar top. The channel is part of the trust now. No one touches the seagrass, and no one builds a wall of yachts. The Sunset is officially a permanent resident of this neighborhood. For the next month, the street transformed. Without the threat of Demetrius looming over us, the businesses began to flourish. Sarah expanded the bakery into a cafe with outdoor seating. Miller started a heritage tool museum in his storefront. And the grotto? The grotto became the place where every local came to celebrate the fact that they still had a home. But Stephen Taylor remained the quiet observer, sitting at the end of the bar, watching the horizon with a restless eye. "You're waiting for the other shoe to drop," I said one evening, sliding a bourbon toward him. Stephen looked up the glass, the amber liquid reflecting the neon Jess and G. "Demetrius doesn't take no for an answer, Sophia. He takes it as a temporary delay. He's been liquidating his Florida assets. That usually means he's preparing for a scorched earth legal maneuver. Or he's found a way to attack us from a completely different angle, one we can't solve with the dusty book." The other shoe arrived the following Tuesday in the form of a polished black limousine that didn't belong to Demetrius. A woman stepped out tall, sharp-featured, and wearing a suit that made Stephen Taylor's linen one look like a rag. She walked into the grotto and didn't look at the menu. She looked at me. "Miss Moretti, I'm Elena Vance. I'm the CEO of the Global Heritage Foundation." My heart skipped. "Are you with Demetrius?" I asked, my hand moving toward the phone. Elena Vance let out a refined, cold laugh. "Demetrius? Hardly. I'm the one who buys people like Demetrius for breakfast. I'm here because your Living Heritage Trust has triggered a red flag in our international registry." She set a sleek holographic tablet on the bar. "By establishing this district, you've unknowingly activated a preservation lock. This land is now so protected, even you can't make changes to it. Not even to fix a leaky roof." I looked at Stephen, who had gone pale. "What does she mean, a preservation lock?" Stephen stood up, his professional mask slipping for the first time. "Elena, we only filed for local protection. We didn't apply for international foundation status." Elena smiled, and it was even more predatory than Demetrius's. "When you used the 1922 charter, you tapped into a treaty that was absorbed by our foundation in the 50s. You saved the street from Demetrius, but you just handed the keys to us." "We aren't developers, Miss Moretti," Elena continued, her eyes scanning the bar with clinical disapproval. "We are conservators, and our vision for this street doesn't involve a noisy bar or a bakery that smells of yeast. We intend to turn this block into a static historical monument. No residents, no businesses, just a perfectly preserved empty shell of 1920s architecture. You have 30 days to vacate." The witty reversal, it seems, has a second edge. The room went cold. We had fought the shark only to be swallowed by the whale. "You can't do that," I whispered. "We own the deeds." Elena tapped her tablet. "The deeds are subject to the trust's bylaws, and the bylaws state that the foundation has administrative oversight in cases of potential cultural degradation." She looked at my beer-stained counter. "And this, Miss Moretti, is the definition of degradation. See you at the end of the month." As Elena's limo pulled away, the neighborhood gathered in the grotto, the celebration from weeks ago replaced by a funeral-like silence. "We outplayed a billionaire," Miller muttered, "but how do you outplay a foundation that owns the very idea of history?" Stephen Taylor was pacing the length of the bar, his mind working at a speed I couldn't track. "She's right about the treaty," he said. "It's an airtight legal trap." But Elena made one tactical error. I looked up, hope flickering. "What error?" Stephen stopped pacing and looked at the robotic owl still perched in the rafters. "She called this place degraded. She views heritage as a dead thing, a statue in a park. But the 1922 charter defines living heritage as an active, evolving ecosystem. If we can prove that this street isn't just a relic, but a vital part of the future economy, the static clause can't be triggered. We don't need a lawyer, we need a spotlight." The plan for Phase 3 was the boldest yet. We weren't going to hide the street. We were going to make it the most famous block in America. We're going to host the Future of History Summit, Stephen declared. We invite the tech giants, the environmentalists, and the media. We show them that the grotto and the bakery aren't just shops, they're the testing ground for sustainable, local-first commerce. We make this street so alive that Elena Vance wouldn't dare touch it. The next 3 weeks were a blur of activity. We used Demetrius's leftover construction fence as the foundation for a high-tech, outdoor innovation hub. Sarah started baking carbon-neutral sourdough. Miller turned his hardware store into a 3D printing center for coral reef restoration. We weren't just a neighborhood anymore, we were a movement. By the time Elena Vance's eviction team arrived, they were met by a crowd of 5,000 people and a dozen news helicopters. Elena Vance stepped out of her car, her composure finally breaking as she saw the static monument she wanted to create was currently hosting a global summit. "What is this?" she hissed, looking at the solar panels on my roof. Stephen Taylor walked out, holding a tablet of his own. "This is the 2026 definition of living heritage, Elena. We've just been granted economic vitality status by the state. Your static clause is officially obsolete. Witty, isn't it?" Elena Vance looked at the crowd of reporters and then back at Stephen Taylor. The clinical coldness in her eyes was replaced by a flickering realization. She had brought a law book to a media circus. Economic vitality status? She repeated, her voice tight. "You've turned a historical treasure into a science fair?" I stepped forward, wipes in hand. "No, Elena, we turned a science fair into a treasure. And since we're now a vitality zone, your foundation's oversight is legally downgraded to consultant only." Stephen Taylor didn't let up. He pulled a final document from his jacket, a thin, translucent sheet of digital paper. "And as our new consultant, Elena, you'll be pleased to know that we've used the foundation's own grant money to fund this summit. Since the treaty you mentioned requires the foundation to support any vital heritage site, you actually just paid for our solar panels and Sarah's new ovens. Witty, isn't it?" Elena Vance's face remained a mask of iron, but her hand trembled as she took the document. The CEO who bought people for breakfast had just been served a bill for a party she wasn't invited to. She looked at the cameras, then at the robotic owl that was currently perched on a news reporter's shoulder. "This isn't over, Stephen," she whispered. "History always wins in the end." She turned and retreated to her limo, the preservation log shattered by the weight of the future. As the limo sped away, the crowd erupted. Sarah, Miller, and the rest of the shop owners were laughing, crying, and hugging. We had survived a billionaire and a global foundation. The street wasn't just safe, it was legendary. But as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows over the Future of History Summit, I noticed Stephen Taylor looking at the water. "The dredging lease," he muttered. "There's one more detail, Sophia." "What detail?" I asked, joining him at the edge of the pier. The water was calm, reflecting the neon glow of the bar. Stephen pointed toward the channel. "Now that we're an economic vitality zone and a heritage trust, we don't just own the water. We own the rights to the energy generated by the tides in this channel." Demetrius's dredging lease wasn't just for a marina, it was for the future power grid of the entire Lower Keys. My heart skipped. "You mean the bar ... the bakery?" "We're going to be an independent power utility." Stephen nodded, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across his face. "We aren't just shopkeepers anymore, Sophia. We're the board of directors for the first community-owned green energy hub in Florida." Demetrius didn't just lose his street. He accidentally gave us the keys to the kingdom. The witty reversal had reached its ultimate peak. The locals were now the tycoons. The next few months were a whirlwind. The grotto became the Grotto Green Energy Hub. We still serve beer and bourbon, but the revenue from the tidal turbines in the channel meant that no one on the street ever had to worry about rent again. Sarah's Bakery became the most famous carbon-neutral shop in the country, and Miller started 3D printing solar-powered boats for the neighborhood. We were the talk of the 2026 Economic Summit. Demetrius didn't go quietly, but he did go away. He was last seen in a small town in Georgia trying to buy an abandoned mall, only to find out that the local zoning board was headed by a woman who had seen our Great Wall mural on Instagram. The Sofia Moretti method was becoming a curriculum for small businesses everywhere. Arrogance has a way of being its own undoing when it meets a well-placed font choice. Stephen Taylor stayed, of course. He was no longer a silent partner. He was the chief legal officer for the trust. He had traded his linen suits for a collection of vintage grotto t-shirts and a permanent tan. He still sat at the end of the bar every evening, but he didn't look tired anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found an architecture worth building, one made of people and fine print rather than steel and ego. One evening, as the tide began to roll in and the turbines hummed softly beneath the pier, a small boat pulled up to the grotto's dock. A young man stepped out, looking nervous and holding a briefcase. He walked up to the bar and looked at the business license. "Are you Sofia Moretti?" he asked. I smiled, wiping down the mahogany counter. "I am. What can I do for you?" He set a tablet on the bar. "I'm with a development group from Miami. We're interested in—" I didn't let him finish. I just pointed to the rafters where the robotic owl was currently blinking its yellow eyes. "Before you start the pitch, you should talk to my associate at the end of the bar. He's a bit of an expert on area of critical concern filings and font sizes." Stephen Taylor looked up from his bourbon and gave the young man a slow, predatory wink. The kid looked at the robot owl, then at Stephen, then at the diamond-encrusted plunger on the back bar. The young developer didn't even open his tablet. He just looked at the three of us, Sofia, Stephen, and the owl, and realized he was outclassed before he'd even said a word. "Actually," he stammered, "I think I'm in the wrong town." He turned and ran back to his boat, the engine roaring as he sped away from our heritage street. We watched him go, the ski on the sign glowing steady and bright above us. "You're getting too good at that, Sophia," Stephen noted, raising his glass. "You didn't even let him get to the part where he offers us $1 billion. I leaned on the bar, the scent of salt air and Sarah's late-night bread filling the room. "Why would I want $1 billion when I already have the sunset?" Stephen chuckled. "Good point. Although I heard Demetrius is finally selling those public restrooms at the end of the pier. Very cheap." I laughed, the sound echoing through the rafters of the bar my father had built. Let him keep them. Every empire needs a throne, even if it's a public one. We clinked glasses bourbon for him, a cold lager for me. The street was alive, the neighbors were prosperous, and the sharks were extinct. We had played the game of fine print and won the world. The Florida Keys were safe, one witty reversal at a time. The moon rose over the Atlantic, lighting up the channel where the tidal turbines were quietly powering our dreams. Sofia's grotto wasn't just a bar anymore, it was a beacon. As I reached up to turn off the neon sign for the night, I paused. The S and the G weren't flickering anymore, but I like to think they still had a little bit of that old spark left in them. The spark that said, "Don't blink, or you'll miss the fine print." The last round was on the house, and the house had never felt more solid. I turned the key in the lock, the cold brass a reminder of where we started and how far we'd come. Stephen Taylor walked me to my car, the night air warm and smelling of home. "Same time tomorrow, Sophia?" he asked. I smiled, the neon reflection dancing in my eyes. "Same time, Stephen. We have a neighborhood to run." The long pour was over, but the story was just beginning.